The wind hits him first. Before he even sees the ridge, before his boots find the frozen grass, the wind slams into his chest like something with a grudge, and 80-year-old Thomas Ashworth grips his walking stick a little tighter and tells himself this is nothing he hasn't handled before. He's wrong about that. He just doesn't know it yet. It's the last week of January, 1963, and the Peak District has turned into something out of an old woodcut. Snow has been falling for 6 days straight, piling into drifts that swallow dry stone walls whole, and the temperature hasn't climbed above freezing since the second night. Thomas has walked these moors for 40 years. He knows the shape of Kinder Scout the way other men know the faces of their children. But today, somewhere between the call below Crowden Head and the long featureless plateau that stretches toward Bleaklow, the moor is going to try to kill him. He doesn't know that yet either. Right now, he's just cold and a little pleased with himself for being out here at all. Thomas set off from the village of Edale a little after 9 that morning, a flask of tea in his rucksack, a slab of fruitcake wrapped in greaseproof paper, and a compass he'd carried since the war. His plan was simple: up onto the plateau, across to the trig point, down the far side before dark. He'd done the walk a dozen times. He knew, roughly, how long each stretch should take, how the light would change as the afternoon wore on, which landmarks would tell him he was on the right track. What he didn't know was that a fresh band of snow was already moving in from the northwest, low and fast, riding on a wind that would soon be gusting past 50 miles an hour. By 11, the sky has gone the color of a bruise. By half past, the first flakes of the new fall start to come sideways, not down, stinging his cheeks like thrown gravel. Thomas stops, turns his back to the wind, and considers his options. This is the moment. This is the one where a different kind of man might have turned around. He almost does. He tells himself, later, that he almost did. But the visibility is still holding, and he's closer to the far descent than he is to Edale, and there's a particular kind of stubbornness that comes from having walked a place for 40 years and never once been beaten by it. So he turns his collar up, tucks his chin down, and keeps walking. Within 20 minutes, the world disappears. It doesn't happen gradually. That's the part people don't understand until it happens to them. 1 minute there's a horizon, a shape to the land, a sense of up and down and forward and back. The next minute there's just white, moving white, roaring white, and the ground under his boots is the only proof he still exists in 3 dimensions. His compass needle swings uselessly against the movement of his own shaking hand. He stops. He breathes. He tells himself the plateau is flat here, that he can't fall far, that all he has to do is hold a bearing and keep moving. But holding a bearing on Kinder Scout in a whiteout, with the wind trying to spin you like a weather vane, is a different kind of problem than holding a bearing on a still afternoon with a map spread out on a kitchen table. He walks for what feels like 20 minutes. It's closer to 2 hours. Somewhere in that stretch, his fruitcake becomes inedible, frozen solid in its wrapping, and his tea, when he finally manages to unscrew the flask with fingers that no longer feel like his own, is lukewarm at best. He drinks it anyway, because some old habit tells him he needs the fuel, needs the warmth, needs something to fight the cold that has stopped being an inconvenience and started to feel like an opponent. His feet are the first thing to really worry him. Not painful anymore, which is worse than pain. A dull, distant numbness, like they belong to someone standing several yards away. He keeps moving. What else is there to do? The wind changes direction, or maybe it's always been changing and he's only just noticed, and for a moment he catches what might be the edge of a gritstone outcrop through the snow, a darker smudge against the white. He heads for it. It isn't the outcrop he was expecting. He isn't entirely sure it's an outcrop at all, or just a trick his frozen eyes are playing on a tired brain. This is where things start to slip. Later, when he tries to describe this part to the mountain rescue volunteer taking his statement, Thomas will struggle to put in order. Time stops behaving the way it should. He remembers deciding to sit down, just for a minute, to get his breath, and he remembers some old, stubborn corner of his mind screaming at him that sitting down out here is exactly how men die, that the cold creeps in fastest when the body stops moving, that this is the oldest trap on the moor and he's not going to fall into it. So he doesn't sit. He forces himself back up, though up isn't quite right either. since he isn't sure he ever fully sat. He starts talking to himself, out loud, into the wind, his own voice swallowed instantly by the noise of it. He recites the names of the fells he can remember, the way you might recite the names of old friends, trying to hold on as something solid while the world keeps sliding sideways. Kinda, Bleaklow, Mamtor, Windhill. He doesn't know it, but this habit, this simple stubborn act of naming things, is very likely what keeps him alive. Somewhere past 3 in the afternoon, with the light already starting to die behind the storm, Thomas finds a shallow groove in the peat, a natural channel cut by decades of meltwater, barely 2 feet deep but enough to break the worst of the wind. He doesn't decide to stop here, so much as his legs simply stop cooperating, and the groove happens to be where he ends up. He knows, in some distant analytical part of his brain, that this is dangerous. He knows that lying still in a snow-covered peat channel in a January storm on Kinderscout is very close to the last thing a man does before he stops doing anything at all. But his legs won't take instructions anymore, so he does the only thing left available to him. He pulls his knees up toward his chest, wraps his arms around them, and starts counting. Not minutes. He has no way of measuring minutes out here anymore. He counts breaths instead. In out 1, in out 2. Somewhere around 400, he loses count and has to start again. And this becomes its own strange, repetitive comfort, a task small enough for a mind that has nothing left to work with. The wind doesn't let up. If anything, it gets worse as the afternoon collapses into evening, and the temperature, already brutal, drops further still. Frost forms on his eyebrows. His breath freezes against the wool of his scarf, turning it into something closer to a sheet of ice than fabric. And somewhere in all of that, lying in a shallow trench of peat with the storm screaming 12 inches above his head, Thomas Ashworth starts to think about his wife. Not in any dramatic, cinematic way, just small things. The particular way she buttered toast. The sound of the kettle on their stove. An argument they'd had 11 years earlier about a leaking gutter. An argument so trivial it seems almost funny to him now, lying here, that it had ever mattered at all. He decides, with a clarity that surprises him, that he is not ready for this to be how it ends. Not over a gutter. Not out here alone in the snow. It's not bravery, exactly. It's something quieter than that. A refusal, almost administrative in its calm, to accept the ending the more seems to be offered. He starts moving again. This is, by any rational measure, a terrible decision. Every piece of advice given to walkers caught out in conditions like this says the same thing. Find shelter, stay put, wait it out, don't waste the last of your strength wandering blind through a whiteout. But rational measures assume a rational situation, and there is nothing rational left about the world Thomas is currently living in. What he does have, though, is 40 years of memory pressed into his legs and feet, a kind of knowledge that doesn't live in the thinking part of the brain at all. He doesn't consciously navigate. He simply starts walking in the direction that some deep, wordless part of him insists is downhill, is away from the plateau, is towards something other than more of this same white nothing. It takes him almost 3 more hours. 3 hours of stumbling, of falling, of getting back up, because some part of him refuses to accept that staying down is an option. 3 hours in which his hands stop working well enough to unscrew his now empty flask, in which he loses his walking stick somewhere in a drift and doesn't have the strength to hunt for it, in which he starts hallucinating, just slightly, the shapes of gateposts and stone walls that aren't there. And then, sometime after 7 in the evening, with the storm finally starting to loosen its grip just enough to let a thin gray twilight through, he sees a light. A real one. A window, glowing yellow against the dark, the unmistakable shape of a farmhouse at the edge of the moor. He doesn't run toward it because running is a thing his body forgot how to do hours ago. He walks, if you can call it walking, a kind of controlled falling forward, one leg and then the other, toward that single square of warm light in a world that has spent the last 8 hours trying to convince him warmth doesn't exist anymore. The farmer who opens the door later says he thought, for one confused second, that someone had propped a snowman up against his porch. Thomas Ashworth's coat is frozen into a solid shell. His eyebrows and eyelashes are crusted white. His hands, when a farmer finally gets him inside and starts working the gloves off, are the color of old wax. But he's alive, cold beyond anything the farmer has words for, frostbitten across 3 fingers and the tips of both ears, but alive and breathing, and after a long, silent minute in front of the fire, able to say, in a voice that sounds like it's coming from somewhere far away, that he'd like a cup of tea if it isn't too much trouble. It takes him 6 weeks to fully recover the feeling in his hands. He loses the very tip of his left ring finger to frostbite, a small, permanent souvenir of the day, the more nearly won. But here's the thing that makes this story worth telling. The thing that outlasts the frostbite and the 6 weeks of recovery and even the ache that comes back in his joints every winter for the rest of his life. Thomas writes it down. Not right away. It takes him almost a year before he can put the words on paper without his hands starting to shake again, but eventually he sits down at his kitchen table, the same table where the famous gutter argument once happened, and he writes out every hour of that day in the kind of careful, unhurried detail that only comes from a mind that has had a long time to turn experience over and over, looking at it from every angle. He writes about the compass needle swinging uselessly, about the fruitcake freezing solid, about the strange, sliding sense of time falling apart in the whiteout, about counting breaths in a peat channel because counting was the only thing left he could control. And he writes, most carefully of all, about the decision to keep moving when every piece of sensible advice said to stay still. Not as an instruction for other walkers to follow, because he's the first to admit it very nearly killed him instead of saving him, but as an honest account of what it actually feels like in the moment when a person has to choose between 2 kinds of danger with no way of knowing which one is the lesser. That account, quietly circulated among local walking clubs and eventually picked up by a regional newspaper, becomes one of the more widely read cautionary pieces on winter hill walking safety to come out of the Peak District in that era. Mountain rescue volunteers start referencing it in their own training talks, not because Thomas did everything right, but because he did everything honestly, and honesty about fear and confusion and bad decisions made under pressure turns out to be far more useful to future walkers than a tidy story about a man who did everything by the book. Thomas Ashworth lives another 19 years after that storm. He keeps walking, though never quite as far, and never again without telling someone exactly where he's going and when he expects to be back. Every January, when the first heavy snow settles onto Kinder Scout, he stands at his kitchen window for a long moment, looking out at the white shape of the moor in the distance, and says nothing at all. His daughter, decades later, still keeps the handwritten account in a drawer in her own home, the pages soft and yellowed at the edges, his careful looping handwriting slightly unsteady in places where the memory of the cold must have found its way back into his hand. She says that when she reads it now, what strikes her isn't the fear or the frostbite or even the moment he saw the farmhouse light. It's the counting, the simple, stubborn act of an old man lying in the snow, refusing to stop breathing on purpose, one number at a time, until the storm ran out of ways to stop him.